everyone. Welcome to Getting Cozy with the COSIs. My name is Jackie. I am the Asian American Pacific Islander Involvement Area Community Organizing Student Intern. And today I organized this podcast to be discussing disordered eating in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Joining me are some of my fellow executive board members from the Asian American Student Union. So if they could introduce themselves. Also, my pronouns are she, her, hers. So starting with Dahe, could you introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm Dahe. I'm a sophomore. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am co-VP of Community Education with Jackie.
Sagar, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sagar. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a sophomore. My position is co-social chair.
And then Patrick.
So I'm Patrick. I'm a sophomore. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am the VP of Administrative Affairs.
Before we get on to the more uplifting part, we're going to be talking about capitalism. Okay. Yeah, we basically...
Ready.
Let's go. We wanted to discuss kind of the ways in which capitalist and consumerist culture influence the way in which we eat and the way in which we view our bodies, and also kind of connect that to our consumption of our culture and our heritage. We learned a phrase back at this conference that we attend as ASU called like boba liberalism. And it's the idea that AAPI culture and heritage isn't necessarily tied to your feelings of like your lineage or your ancestry, but it instead has been ascribed to like objects and things like boba or noodles or different types of food. And when you attach your cultural and ancestral meaning to objects, it automatically becomes like consumerist or capitalist to some extent. And how do we address that? And I think the idea of like consumption is directly tied to the way in which we view food and the way in which we view our bodies. Because if we're told that, the way of success is to consume and to assume all of these material things, and the way in which we should connect to our culture is by consuming food and collecting all these material things. But at the same time, we're told you have to look like you aren't consuming anything. How are we then kind of torn apart by those two different messages? And how do we kind of reconcile those narratives? Like, I don't have an answer for it, but I think like those kinds of forces inherently have influenced the way in which we think.
So I remember I was having a conversation with Kevin, who is the coordinator at MICA, and he was telling me like his thesis on like Asian food and like how it's consumed and perceived by society. And he was telling me basically that the history of Chinese food was that it was served as a greasy cuisine to appease like drunk white people.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like late, it was open like late at night, and so like a lot of like customers would come there. So he was telling me how that framework of cuisine, because Chinese cuisine wasn't always like that. I think it was like distinctively Chinese American. He was saying how that framework was meant to appease white races or to appease white society, because they had to change their culture in order to fit this sort of assimilation.
I think about now in like this current pandemic about how people have rallied around like local Chinatowns because we're using that food that originally was created for like Western purposes. Like we are now rallying around it to support those businesses that are fronted by AAPI families.
No, I'm not like super well versed in like capitalism and all that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but I know that. Stop shaking your head.
Read some Marx.
I know that if you want to like hop on whenever, but I know like I'm Korean, so like a big part of like Korean culture in America in terms of food is obviously like Korean barbecue, and a lot of K barbecue places. This is more like I'm like kind of shifting back to like the actual like eating part of it.
Mm-hmm.
A large part of Korean barbecue is eat as much as you can, and it's supposed to be like this whole social event. And if you're not eating, then you're not participating, and you're kind of like being a Debbie Downer in that situation. And so I know that I've gone to Korean barbecue places with friends who have been on diets, and it's kind of like we're sitting there and like 3 of the 4 of us are eating and the 4th person is just sitting there the entire time. And the whole point is like, I like the whole point of Korean barbecue isn't so much the food as it is like the experience surrounding it with the people that you're with.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how this ties into capitalism at all, but in terms of just like the eating part of it, I think that that's another like play that kind of conflict in people, because it's like, oh yeah, I should be eating because it's like a social experience. But at the same time, if I keep eating and I just keep consuming all this like meat and all these like, because obviously Korean barbecue is not, there are like no vegetables in Korean barbecue, okay? So if I just keep eating all this meat, like how will that affect my weight later? Like, will I wake up tomorrow, will I be bloated? And like it causes all these like negative thoughts.
Yeah. No, I totally think that can be related to like what we're just talking about, because it's like the idea, because personally, like when I go to Korean barbecue, like you set this goal, like when I go to Iron Age, like I want to make it to 10 rounds, like with my people. So you end up like consuming until you are sick. And it's the idea that like capitalism like drives itself into a ground, like it will continue to try and accrue so much wealth until it like literally implodes on itself, like we are seeing right now, like in this current like global recession. But the idea that also that if you don't participate in it, you are seen as somebody who like is outside of the social circle, or like you ascribe yourself some sort of shame that you can't act like everybody else or participate in kind of that community, which I think can also be kind of related to the idea that like if you aren't successful, if you don't participate in trying to accrue wealth, then you are isolated because you're not acting within the means of like the boundaries of society. Yeah.
So I just had a thought. Whenever, like, let's just say we have or not relatives, like friends or like family friends over, right? And if my family, if like the friend that's coming over is white, my mom makes it her mission to cook naan. Her mission to cook naan, right? No, you won't see any other dishes that I had like last week, last year. Every single time that I have a family friend that's not of Indian descent, she makes it her mission to just cook naan.
Why naan specifically?
Like different varieties of naan, but only naan, right? And I asked her why. I was like, this is so weird for a very long time. Although I don't know why I noticed it, not like or recently. Why do you do this? And she was like, oh, I have to live up to that image that Indian foods always stem from naan. That the foundational dish comes from naan. And I'm a bit confused as to like why would you do that? Like, why don't you like broaden your horizons, try something new? And she's always telling me that, oh, every single time that other like people think Indian food or desi food, this kind of cuisine, first thing they think is naan, right? And I'm like, okay, why don't you diversify that? And she's like, no. I don't want them to have a bad opinion of our cuisine. Okay, so it's my like we've sort of.
I think it's interesting that she's like internalized and tried to cater to like white perceptions of what like brown cuisine is.
Right.
Which I think is like.
But again, that's like, why do we have to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Why do we have to cater?
Right.
But I think it does come down to, like Sagar said, his mom said, like, well, not only do we have to live to that, I think, like, kind of related, like, last year when my mom had, like, well, I invited my friends over for dinner at my house. Jackie was there.
It was delicious.
And my mom made, like, the typical Korean foods that she usually makes for, like, potlucks and things. So there was, like, I don't know if you guys know what bulgogi is, but it's, like, this sweet marinated meat. She made tteokbokki, which is, like, spicy rice cake. And she made japchae, which is like a glass noodle. And these are things that you just typically find at Korean places. And she always makes those same dishes because they not only cater to white people taste, where they're usually sweeter, but another thing is because they are sweeter and there's like a higher chance that they're going to be enjoyed by the people eating it. She wants that to be the representation of Korean food. She doesn't want to give them some like fermented smelly thing that is super traditional in Korea, but like she doesn't want to give that to them because she doesn't want that to be their perception of Korean food.
See, that's funny because every other dish you refer to as fermented and funny and like smelly, right? And so I think that we're kind of like caught up in that little that kind of stigma where, okay, there are only certain outside of American tradition, there are only certain dishes, certain cuisines that can be preserved in coming generations. And I also think that's like really sad because that's just like a loss of culture there. But yeah.
Yeah. No, I think about like I think similarly to that about when my family makes dumplings, because like I also invited like Dahe and all of our friends, yeah, to make dumplings. But the interesting thing about like after you make them is that once they're in the fridge, they stink. Like they're so stinky.
Oh,
But like it's just odd because they smell really bad, but then when you eat them, they're so delicious. And so like that's why like my brother, when he was in college and he was living in an apartment, would never bring dumplings to his to the fridge. He would store it in his own fridge because he didn't want people to have that perception like he eats stinky food. And so I think like this whole idea of like we're trying to protect ourselves and our culture by presenting the best face, but at the same time is that also catering to like what white people want of our representations of our culture, which is like we're
like
kind of like a catch-22 in that situation.
and like bringing it back to like boba liberalism, I think it's like a more or less tagging on like a capitalistic agenda with a convenient yet concerted visor of like one's like roots, identity, origin, and that being representative through like a certain like plate of cuisine. Like, okay, this cuisine will generate the most amount of consumers.